everybody's saying, oh, Putin is tough, Russia's tough, like they're going to go after Ukraine. They have it, though.
The reformists who are currently in power now, they are neoliberals. They are, they advocate for free market, policies within Iran and further integration with the West.
Everyone who started negotiating with the United States and with Israel and slowly started to cooperate, they were all defanged.
I think what people need to understand, we're looking at this war in stages. It's not over. This was always going to be a long war. So therefore, each pause, each memorandum of understanding, each ceasefire is not the end of that war. And that's the problem with a lot of commentary. It draws a line under what is currently happening and doesn't look at it as part of a stage of the war against not only Iran, but against the global south. Basically the folding in of every single country in this region. There's a reason that Iran was the last country mentioned by General Wesley Clark.
Any country that's made a deal with the United States has never ended in a good place. And no matter how much faith I have in Iran.
Good day, everyone. We are here with another show with a power panel, three sisters, you could say. Vanessa Billy, of course, and Fiorella Isabel, both veterans of BettBeat Media. And Elina Xenofontos, who is slowly becoming a regular as well. We are going to talk a bit about the geopolitics of today, Iran, possible economic integration, maybe a hot war, we don't know. But I think all of you have some very interesting things to say about that. And I wanted to start maybe with you, Vanessa. I heard you talk about you're living of course, in West Asia, you live in the region. And you are saying that things are being prepared. There are preparations going on for potentially another hot war. You're also fearful of certain things, such as economic influence by the United States into Iran, for example. Elina, you just wrote a very good article on that, about how that is happening in Cuba. We also have, of course, Venezuela in Latin America. Fiorella is a specialist, of course, on Latin America. So maybe we can just combine all these ideas. Why don't you go ahead, Vanessa, and guide us there?
I'd really like to start off with Alina's article, which I found really interesting. I recommend everybody goes to her Substack and reads through it, because it's a very interesting article, and I think I think what it's very good for is opening this kind of discussion, because everyone has been talking about the division within Iran itself between the reformists or the neoliberals, those that, like Javad Zarif, want to pivot far more towards the West, want to open the blockade, the isolationism, and so on, that they perceive to be the current Iranian policy. And I think what Elina does is raise the alarm about the recent MOU and the fact that it actually represents a very typical imperialist policy to infiltrate the country through investment, through the establishment of economic ties and partnerships, and so on. And that this represents a risk to the country that perhaps hasn't been recognized, and hasn't been recognized by many of the commentators on the MOU. So maybe if we start with Elina, I'd like to get your idea of the response to your article, because you were talking about it before we came on air, that you're getting a very confused response from particularly the, let's say, anti-imperialist bloc in the West, who are saying one thing, and then when kind of confronted with the facts of your article or the potential threat that you're actually talking about in your article, then they are kind of contradicting their own commentary on Iran and what Iran represents. So, Alina, let's go over to you.
Yeah, so it was very interesting to see when I published this report, this article rather. I mean, on the one hand, what I found quite fascinating is that nobody else had really discussed it within that context yet, especially within the anti-imperialist sort of bloc within the West, as you said. It was, the Memorandum of Understanding is sort of being rejoiced as this triumphant, win, all-out win for Iran without any necessary concessions, sort of, not dissecting all the implications of it for Iran, and the ways in which American capital, and that when we say that we mean imperialism, operates, and they do that by using and abusing their financial stronghold over the world, and how that is filtered through the Memorandum of Understanding. And in response to obviously what I wrote, the one thing that stood out to me was sort of, all this is well and nice. We understand your perspective. However, Iran's got this. Iran is a unified front, and there's no way that they will allow the neoliberal policies of the West to infiltrate Iran. And some people went so far as to say, well, a theocracy is the one that has the absolute say ultimately in Iran, and they're more the hardliners against the neoliberal policies of the West, which is rather ironic because the long-standing sort of political narrative that has been perpetuated by the West has been that Iran is obviously this autocratic theocracy where democracy doesn't exist, where political opposition doesn't exist, where political parties don't exist. And it's actually the left or the anti-imperialist, bloc within the West that have been the ones to argue, well, this is not true. Iran has a very complex political sort of establishment. It's an organism of its own that has its own contradictions and oppositions, and it would be a mistake to classify that all as being singularly controlled by the theocracy. And we've often discussed the idea of how the reformists have come into power and how there are distinctly politically different, for example, to the centrists and to the more conservative and hardline factions within Iran. So now to see the same anti-imperialist bloc come around and essentially say that there is no real political opposition, that Iran is a unified front, and that above all, the theocracy, and some of them actually went on to say that it can be compared with the CPC, is the ultimate defining sort of factor in this, completely, and is an antithetical to the argument that they have been making this entire time, that Iran is a complex democracy of its own, different to, it's different in the way that it's structured to the West, but it is a complex democracy of its own. And so through that lens, their idea is, although the United States is going to try to infiltrate Iran, but through essentially buying it out gradually through corporate capture, which is basically what this Memorandum of Understanding kind of proposes, their argument is, well, this is going to be controlled by the theocratic hardliners who will not allow that to happen, failing to express how that's possible, failing to acknowledge the political fractions within Iran. And for example, much like you correctly stated, Vanessa, the fact that the reformists who are currently in power now, they are neoliberals. They are, they advocate for free market, policies within Iran and further integration with the West, how that is going to essentially, reconcile with the centrists and the hardliners, and then there's the other angle as well, is that you have the IRGC that controls so many aspects and industries within Iran, fundamentally because of the sanctions. It was in reaction to the sanctions that they needed to do so in order to keep up the economy of Iran. How is that going to play in? Because what the United States is trying to do is try to incentivize these different, factions and people, to provide these personal incentives to fracture Iran internally, and that's something that they weren't able to do with military sort of action against Iran, but they're trying to do it in a whole other way. And this is how neocolonialism has always operated. This is what imperialism always does. And it's ironic that it's the anti-imperialist bloc in the West that is the one that is not seeing this. So yeah, I mean, this is something that I've observed with regards to Iran, and I don't think we're getting the kind of analysis and the complexity behind not just Iran, but even what's happening now in Venezuela and in Cuba, by a lot of the analysts currently in the West.
Yeah, Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny that you say that. I actually had this exact conversation with Dimitri Laskaris a couple of days ago about my fear of this economic integration, the slow marketization of Iranian society, with the intention that eventually it will become just another vassal state in West Asia. Now, of course, Iran is a humongous society, a very complex society, but the power of how can you say that material pressures of capitalism are amazing, how that transforms societies. And actually, right at the same time, maybe a bit earlier, I wrote an article on Substack called "The Handshake of Death," why Iran should not negotiate with evil or something. I forgot the exact title. Um, but I said the same thing. Like everyone who started negotiating with the United States and with Israel and slowly started to cooperate, they were all defanged. All of them, whether it's Egypt, whether it's even the PLO. The PLO became suddenly a strong arm of the colonizer. It's so dangerous how you can transform very radical groups, radical societies by slow economic integration. And I'm just baffled, baffled that in all these societies there are still people believing in that integration with the Western capitalist system. But on the other hand, I wonder if they really believe it or if these are often very rich people, business people who benefit from it. That can also be a reason, of course, because it's becoming really unbelievable, man, that Western imperial system to become part of that. It's such a dystopian, psychopathic, horrible thing when you see what's happening. Epstein files, genocide, war. I mean, aren't people waking up? You know what I mean? Anyway, these are all comments. You guys go ahead.
I, I was going to actually just say one thing that I thought was very interesting, and then I'll let obviously Vanessa and Foriela speak. But what is also quite interesting is the way in which identity politics has a tendency to kind of filter through these sort of conversations by so-called leftists within the, not even leftists, but even those that go as far as to call themselves Marxists or socialists, even. Their argument tends to be, well, the Iranian people has suffered excessively, which is true, right? The Iranian people, the suffocation of their economy over the last more than 4 decades since 1979 has it had a massive economic impact on Iran and its people. This goes without question. I mean, especially when you look at the impact that it's had on its health services or access to basic food, etc. And of course, Iran has worked into establishing food security, and it has come close to accomplishing even a universal health care, had it not been for the sanctions that then were reimposed in 2018 by Trump himself. However, we're moralizing these arguments and therefore trying to justify it through that lens of, well, you're a Westerner, which, I mean, I'm from Cyprus, to be honest. It's a bit of a more complex conversation to have, but you don't understand what the Iranian people have gone through. This is not really, it's an irrelevant conversation to have in the context of what we're looking at is that we're not lacking empathy for the Iranian people. In fact, if anything, we have a tremendous amount of empathy for what the Iranian people have been going through, just like the Venezuelan people, just like the Cuban people. But what we're concerned about is how that asphyxiation, which is economic warfare, which was meant for the purpose of causing them to capitulate to Western interests to begin with, how that's now going to be exploited so as to sustain imperialism and to subjugate their country's sovereignty, which will inevitably have an impact on their people yet again, and it will become leverage. And I think that's important if we care about the people of these countries, but also more broadly, if we're talking about weakening imperialism for the global south and moving away from that US hegemonic control.
Absolutely. Fiorella, your thoughts?
I I just have a comment on everything basically because one of the things I noticed as a U.S. American that really irritated me was the way this was framed as Iran winning and the U.S. losing, and it was very, very childlike, elementary type of commentary and analysis. And I'm not saying that to be rude or to just be mean or degrading. I'm saying it because that's what it was. There was no underlying nuanced discussion about what the MOU actually was, what it required from Iran, why the United States is going to go and shift their tone, why Donald Trump came out and started speaking against Netanyahu and creating this idea for like the sixth time this year about how there's a fight between the United States and Israel simultaneously while the US defense is merging further with integration with Israel, with Palantir. And then not only that, we have seen certain figures like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and a lot of these figures that are now deemed, a sort of anti-establishment figures that come from the establishment but somehow saw the light and are now, super anti-Zionist. And they don't like Trump anymore. So they've been pushing J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, the guy that was funded and essentially created from Peter Thiel, the co-founder of Palantir. So I feel like all the knowledge went out the window when it came to looking at this, because there's a psychological element in the United States where people look at world events as some sort of movie where they look at the heroes and the villains. And of course, Iran has suffered. Iran has put its life on the line to not just defend itself and its resistance, but also places like Lebanon, the people of Lebanon. And so it's inspiring to see that, and it's also kind of made people put this sort of religious, spiritual like faith in Iran that this is it, this is the way. And so they just stop at that and they look at this and they like the humiliation, because there is a level of humiliation that the United States has experienced. I mean, there is nuance to this, right? They have experienced a level of public, the public perception of them is not where it was, just like with Israel. So there is a level of that, but that's where the analysis stops. And, now Iran wins and Iran holds all the cards. Do you think, if you know everything that you know about the United States, that there isn't another card that they haven't pulled out, that this is not where this ends? I find it extremely naive. And one other point I want to make regarding this, it reminds me of the Alaska deals that Russia has been offered via the likes of Kirill Dmitriev, who is, of course, the Kremlin he's not the Kremlin spokesperson officially, but he's the one that has been negotiating with the U.S. Ambassadors that are Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff, the same ones that, of course, are tasked with the Middle East, with West Asia, and those negotiations. So for me, it is very clear what the United States and Washington and its Zionist ally are doing is that they're negotiating also their other hand, which is using the economic transactional way, where they say, well, why not invest? Why not do this? Well, we're seeing what's happened with Venezuela, what's going to happen with Cuba. We've seen the takeover of Latin America right now. And then we're also seeing these same type of strategies that are not just overt operations like we've seen, but also in case that fails, we're going to have a long-term plan for a more covert, more friendly like takeover. And that's what it should be looked on. And you're absolutely right, Kareem. Any country that's made a deal with the United States has never ended in a good place. And no matter how much faith I have in Iran, you have to look at the intricacies of the divisions that exist, which very much exist. Like in any other country, it's not a monolith. And you have to wonder how dangerous that can be in the long run.
And Fiorella, can I ask you, because you are very familiar with the region, would you say that a similar phenomenon is going on with Venezuela, or would you say it feels different? How would you compare that to this kind of economic neutralization?
Well, I mean, I think what's happened in Venezuela, I mean, is absolutely devastating for the Bolivarian Revolution, right? I don't necessarily adhere to what a lot of people say, where it's like everything was planned, that Maduro gave himself up, or that somebody gave up Maduro. I mean, there's not enough evidence for me to know exactly how that went down. But what I do think is different about Venezuela is that you still have the Chavistas in power, but are they truly in power, right? It seems like they're sequestered. It seems like they're acting under the barrel of a gun. That's what it seems like to me. And at the end of the day, does Venezuela, does Cuba, do they have another alternative when they don't have the defense to do something else? Their alternative would be to resist, but what are they resisting, besides their physical bodies? What else are they going to have? They don't have the military capacity. The United States is right there. They've already said they consider all of the Americas their territory. I think what is more of the question is, will Latin America as a whole make alliances required to fight back? And I think it's going to start with the people of these countries going against the governments that either have been installed or they feel have been interfered with from abroad. And so that's where I think Venezuela is at. I do think it is being slowly sequestered via the transactional type of relationship. We've seen Trump gloating about taking Venezuela's oil. It's horrible, especially now with what just happened with the earthquake that hit. Of course, now Venezuela is in a more vulnerable position to be quote unquote rescued by the likes of Washington. And it's, we see Delcy Rodriguez thanking Donald Trump in her tweets. And so this just becomes more of like this reaction, right? We see online, oh, look, she's a sellout, she's doing this, but what is happening behind the scenes? What does this mean? What is happening to Venezuela? I think that's what we really need to look at, rather than the emotional reaction we can all get from seeing, the Venezuelan president thank the leader of the country that kidnapped their president and their leader. So I think we need to go a little bit deeper than the immediate emotions that we all understandably just attain, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. You have something to jump in, Vanessa?
No, I mean, I think when we look at the model that Alina and Fee have just been talking about, I think you only have to look at Syria to see how eventually it works. Even if in the early years of the regime change war against Syria, so from 2011, we know that some of the close circle administration and officials.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we look at the imperialist, neocolonialist model that Alina and Fee have just been discussing, and if we then look at Syria, which was a 14 years, actually, in my opinion, it was a 75-year war that began after the independence of Syria in 1946. But culminated in the last regime change war against Syria, which began in 2011. If we remember that in the very early months of that war, or this war, as it's still ongoing, many of the close circle politicians, government officials were bribed, or there were attempts to bribe them. And the majority of them turned them down. But then when you have a war which continues militarily up until really 2018, 2020, and then on top of that, you add, thanks to President Trump, this other layer of economic pressure with the Caesar sanctions, which was on top of the previous sanctions, which effectively then flawed the economy, flawed the people. US were occupying the oil in the Northeast. So you had energy deprivation, you had food deprivation, water deprivation, etc. And then, of course, you had the neoliberals, the elite within the society that had already gathered power during the war, because, of course, what happens in wartime, corruption comes to the surface and starts to profiteer from the effects of war, right? And so I think what people need to understand, we're looking at this war in stages. It's not over. This was always going to be a long war. So therefore, each pause, each memorandum of understanding, each ceasefire is not the end of that war. And that's the problem with a lot of commentary. It draws a line under what is currently happening and doesn't look at it as part of a stage of the war against not only Iran, but against the global South, basically the folding in of every single country in this region. There's a reason that Iran was the last country mentioned by General Wesley Clark, because Iran, as Alina touched on, has effectively created an environment which is totally separate to the global capitalist mafia, even through the usury free banking, through the free healthcare, free education, just as Syria had done previously. Syria then fell, at least temporarily. Iran is kind of, for the global capitalist mafia, it's the head of the snake of the free world. And so therefore, this war against Iran, we know that, for example, Mossad created a special operations organization 4 years ago. So if you look at that in the timeline, go back to 2022, when you had the Masa Amini riots. You then had the 12-day war, the riots in January this year, which actually began peacefully with the Bazaris going out on the streets to protest for the economic conditions that they were working under, something that I myself saw also when I was in Iran in 2022. So I think the problem is there's very few people looking at the longevity. There's very few people looking at this as a continuous journey towards the destruction of Iran. Even when you look at the difference in presidencies, and this has always been my argument, and it's always the sword I kind of fall on whenever someone else is elected, and Fee knows this as well. Because when we went from Biden to Trump, everyone was screaming at me that Palestine is only one issue and that Trump is going to end all the wars. And my argument is no. If you look at the roadmap, Trump laid the ground for Biden. Biden laid the ground for Trump, right? So I think in some way we have to keep this continuity, because that is what is lacking in discourse. It's like we're constantly commenting in a reactionary way to what is currently happening without looking at what the next stage of that war might be. And it's sometimes difficult to do that, even here in Lebanon and even previously in Syria. We all knew after the ceasefire with Hezbollah in November 2024 that the pivot was going to be towards Syria. No one expected what actually happened in Syria. And so what that certainly taught me as an analyst is to expect the unexpected. And when it comes to dealing with the global capitalist mafia, with the Zionist bloc, we should be expecting the unexpected. And I think it's correct to raise the alarm while understanding the predicament of the countries we're talking about, like Fee touched on with Venezuela. What can they actually do? They were effectively abandoned by both Russia and China from any kind of solidarity, military perspective, right? And they're literally overlooked by the US. So I don't see them as being in a situation like Hezbollah is, for example, here in Lebanon, where they do have the support of the regional axis and they do have the support of Iran. Iran has included them in the MOU, for example. So I think that's my point. I think each stage in the war is not the end of the war. And I think we need to be keeping ourselves alert as to the next step that the West is going to take. I think saying that, if we all keep quiet, the US is just going to collapse is not an argument, basically.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Can you check the chat, by the way, Vanessa? So you have the chat open, then you can Can you see
Okay.
what I said? But yeah, I totally agree. And I also wanted to say something, jump on something that Alina said, and Vanessa and Fiorella and myself have said this often as well. We have a very difficult task trying to get a nuanced discussion about things that are happening on the side that we sympathize with. It's exceptionally difficult to, for example, say there may be something wrong about what's going on in Iran, or what you said something about Cuba, Elena. You can say that. You can tell about that later. We, Fiorella and Vanessa and me, often have talked about, for example, our worries about certain aspects of Chinese or Russian foreign policy. If we want to find a way that we can improve the kind of situation that we are in, we have to be able to critically discuss these things. For example, if we cannot say that, hey guys, this may actually be a very bad idea, you're opening your market for the United States, and that is a way of colonizing a society. You're a boutique leftist. You're a, and it's just it's so anti-Marxist and anti-leftist to not being able to engage in a materialist analysis of what is going on. You know what I mean? I mean, it's that is typical liberal identity and identitarianism, by saying you are a boutique leftist and you are. It's so simplistic, and it's just so insulting to the intellect of people who try to understand it. You know what I mean? Your thoughts, Alina?
Yes, I was gonna. There's a lot to say that I've been accumulating gradually through this conversation. So the first thing I want to say is, I mean, even from a Marxist perspective, what if I mean, Marx's entire work was the critique of capital, right? You cannot be even. You can't call yourself anything along those lines if you are failing to critique or at least apply material analysis to everything that's currently occurring, and to understand that this is a lengthy process. Much like Vanessa said, it's a process towards liberation. It's a struggle, and it's continuous. And when it comes to the United States, what I've constantly told people the last few years that I've been doing this is that at the end of the day, we have to understand one thing: their power, their hegemony is now being brought to question. Because whether we like it, whether we have criticisms of China or not, it's now becoming, it has been now for quite some time, a rival power, which obviously threatens the interests of the ruling class in the United States, who want complete hegemonic control and don't like the dependency that they have on China. But to try to isolate and contain them, they're trying to take out all these, their allies or regions that are haven't succumbed to Western imperialism. Syria is one classic example of that, right? And I actually, when somebody said, Vanessa, actually, you said that nobody had actually anticipated it. I will say this: on July 24, I did an episode with Colonial Outcast. Yeah, it was July 24. Yeah, and I had actually said from then, could we please look at what's going on in Syria, because the Kurdish forces are they're releasing in the thousands. I remember saying this, the ISIS fighters, and I'm like, this is not happening by accident. This is a strategic move that's happening behind the scenes to prepare them for to prepare them to basically topple Assad, whilst the resistance is being slowly weakened against, in their war against the Zionist entity that was ongoing at the time. And I remember nobody was paying attention to me at the time when I was saying it, but I was quite emphatic about it, because the mission of the United States has always been to maintain hegemony. And now, because they're seeing that power of this gradually deteriorate, they're becoming all the more desperate, which is why we're seeing them outright no longer, they're not even trying to maintain a modicum of diplomatic etiquette anymore in the way that they used to say even 10, 15 years ago, because desperate time, desperate measures. Syria had to fall instantly. I mean, they could no longer continue to drag it out. The entire economic warfare, the sanctions, what the Kurdish forces did by basically, depriving the country of oil and its revenue and its income, all of that hollowed out the economy specifically to create the conditions that would have allowed for this to happen. And the same thing that we're seeing And this is the same kind of process now that we've seen in Syria, sorry, not Syria, in Cuba, in Venezuela, and now this is what they're trying to do in Iran, and it's going at a faster pace now. We're seeing them amp up the pressure because time is of essence. They need to, break, try to deteriorate so far as possible any avenue by which the BRI would have materialized, or any sort of prospects by which, the global south, and especially these countries that are also very significant, many of them being oil rich territories that are close to geopolitical significant trade routes, all of these countries would not be allowed to participate in a growing new financial order per se that would diminish the United States' ability to continue to press on to the kind of economic pressures that they've been using so far. So it's either now or never, and this is why we're seeing that escalation. And I remember last year, it was right about a month after Trump came into power, I had said, in actuality, I think the establishment there would have wanted Trump to come into power because it does several things. Trump is, he's kind of erratic. He will continue in the same sort of trajectory that Biden was on. I always say there's a continuity of agenda, right? No, this is what we always see. There's really no difference at all between the two parties, but in the eyes of the people, it represents a difference. So it keeps that bipartisan kind of narrative that there's a two-party system in the US and that people have a choice. It keeps that going. And Trump is crazy enough. That's how he's sort of, that's the rhetoric around him, right? That he's going to accelerate this process that the US has been attempting to achieve. And then at the end of all this, he's going to essentially be thrown out. The Democrats will come in back in like the good guys and basically continue in a more subtle way what Trump has escalated. And it's all part, and then this whole thing will appear as though, see, the Democrats are not so bad, because we saw the same thing when Biden came in. He continued almost all of Trump's foreign policies. He didn't change a damn thing, but nobody noticed because, Trump had already pulled the trigger. He was just continuing it. He didn't take back any of the policies that Trump had actually put through. And I actually also wanted to say a couple of things as well, like of Venezuela, just really quickly, if that's all right with everybody. When we're talking about Venezuela as well, and people are saying, oh, we have, the Bolivarian kind of political establishment is really playing a 4D chess game here. They're going to allow capital to come in, and it's going to replicate the China model, and it's just, but they're going to have control over that capital. Same sort of arguments that we hear with Iran. I sometimes wonder if people have actually sat down to look at what exactly the policies and the reforms that Venezuela has undergone. And when you start to look at it, I mean, what's essentially happened right now in Venezuela is not really that different to what we saw in Iraq, even, because the executive order that was passed by Trump essentially created, what was it, like it was like it means all the revenue for Venezuela's oil, its sales, and its general wealth is deposited, and only allows the U.S. to essentially decide how that money is going to be relocated. And in fact, the government of Venezuela has to actually submit every month a balance sheet, etc., of what they need and why they need those funds. And the U.S. controls those funds. Therefore, in effect, the U.S. controls the wealth and the political establishment of Venezuela. And this is no different to the same kind of measure that we saw in Iraq in 2003, where essentially all its oil revenues are deposited in a bank account in New York City, with the Federal Reserves, gradually giving them, providing Iraq with their oil revenues at a pace that is comfortable to them. And that is also the reason why Trump was able to leverage that in the recent elections in Iraq, for example, to make sure that Malik, I think, was not allowed to run in the elections. So we can see here how Venezuela is already compromised by the fact that it no longer has access to its own wealth. It essentially allows private corporations to decide how much oil they're going to produce. They decide on how it's going to be sold, and the state of Venezuela receives funds in royalties. This is exactly the same how it was prior to Chavez. So we're seeing a return to the same conditions that brought about the Bolivarian Revolution to begin with. And there's no more state control over how their own economy is going to operate, or even with regards to their own revenues. And this is very important. And we're seeing the same thing now that's going to happen in Cuba, who is privatizing its financial systems, that is effectively saying that, all foreign direct investment and private capital can buy out major industries, and they don't have to have massive state ownership anymore. There will be no longer state ownership of these industries. So that means that they won't be able to subordinate that financial capital or have ways by which to regulate how it operates in their country. And this is how imperialism works. And these have been, they have been victories for the US, and not accepting that does not allow us to understand how to move forward. And it's really this is the most frustrating aspect behind it. I'm not here saying that, oh, the US has won and that's it. No, we're not saying that at all. But what we're saying is that we have to acknowledge what's happened here, and understand that they have secured, to a certain extent, definitely, I would say, the Americas at this point, and that they're trying to do the same thing in Iran. And this is where I'll just sort of finish off my little rant, so to speak, and give the floor to everyone else. When you look at Iran, so this is, my position is, um, after decades, like I said, of sanctions, and then the war, and there's been two wars. Okay, there was last year, we have the 12-day war, which obviously inflicted something like I think it was 25 was it a million in destruction, I think more in Iran. And obviously the protests, and we know how the protests were hijacked. I mean, this is something that is the Zionists and the US intelligence apparatus has been gloating about. And we also have the information to back that with the the smuggling of Starlink and all that into Iran, and how that was weaponized, among obviously the weapons that were found. But they did as well. They destroyed hospitals. They brought destruction to civilian infrastructure, and now Iran then after that went through a major war of its own. So this was meant to strangulate the economy, to then, as I said, pop in with these memorandum of understanding, saying, well, you need the capital, we'll unfreeze your assets, we'll give you what your economy needs, but, and this is where it comes in, you have to behave. And JD Vance made that very clear when he says Iran will receive these funds, quote, if they behave. And what they mean is if it abides by Western interests. And because Iran is has been such the backbone in many ways of the axis of resistance, I believe that what the US is trying to do as well there is to infiltrate and compromise Iran, so as to also weaken its support of the axis in the region, as they try to filter out and weaken, like, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and try to secure Lebanon and so-called normalize the region. Now, I believe that'll be very difficult to accomplish, because there is the human aspect behind that, and there are many Lebanese that will stand against that. And we're also seeing the repercussions of what they've accomplished in Syria. They haven't been able to consolidate it, right? Because of the different factions and the chaos between all the different communities that has unleashed. This is what happens when you put ISIS in power, right? So or Al Qaeda in power. So this is what their aim is. And I think this is where for now they're going to try to rein it. My personal belief, and this is where I want to bring Vanessa into that conversation, and she's obviously in Lebanon as not right now. I believe they'll actually rein in Israel to a certain degree, so that they can try to lock Iran into this deal. That's my personal belief. And in doing so, try to leverage that, so as to kind of fracture the axis of resistance even more so, and therefore isolating Hezbollah, by which then they'll be able to encircle Hezbollah and try to, I guess, weaken it, destroy it, and assert their control over the region. I think that's sort of what I'm seeing. Obviously, there's a lot to expand on that, and I'm going to give the pass over now to Vanessa if she wants to comment on that. But yeah, this is how imperialism operates.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of reigning in Israel is never a practical one, because I think what happens is a proxy is brought in to conduct the war on Israel's behalf. Because I think, as Fee also spoke about, this kabuki theater of Trump falling out with Netanyahu, etc., is nonsense. The roadmap is absolutely interlinked. I mean, we're seeing, as Fee said again, the merger of intelligence, of security structures, of military under the banner of enhancement. But we're literally seeing the US and Israel become one. I mean, this was intimated back in 2021 when Israel left EUCOM, the European COM, and joined CENTCOM basically as part of the Abraham Accord. So we've been heading in this direction anyway, of this integration of the US and Israeli military and intelligence. So I don't see any separation. I only see manufactured separation when they need to provide plausible deniability, either for the US or for Israel. And in this case, it's providing plausible deniability for Israel. Why? Because despite all the statements to the opposite, Trump always says the quiet part out loud. And when he said back in May that we can weaponize Syria against Hezbollah because Israel isn't succeeding in what it's doing, and he then repeated it very recently, Giuliani has gone on record saying, oh, no, I'm sure that's not what Trump means. But I know from my sources on the ground, both in Syria and in Lebanon, that Giuliani has been building a strike force for some time. It's not a defense force, it's a strike force all along the eastern Lebanese-Syrian borders. I know now that there are Ukrainian forces, again, in western Aleppo and southern Tartus. So what does this mean? Exactly what happened in Idlib. You had the Ukrainian special forces coming in and training and providing drone technology. So they're giving FPV drones, they're giving surveillance technology and so on. And funnily enough, this all came after Zelensky's visit back in April. So what we're seeing again is this increasing of Giuliani's capability by Ukraine, which of course is also backed by the US and the UK in particular. MI6 is embedded in Damascus in the presidential palace. They're running operations through Giuliani and Shaibani. Where there is potential for division and conflict, as you said, within the factions, the two main divisions that are being established to lead the operations against Lebanon are actually Turkish proxies. And we've seen in the last couple of days the assassination of al-Araidi, who's the leader of Haras al-Din, which is the one al-Qaeda element that was always in opposition to Giuliani, even in Idlib. And so currently what you have is Turkey saying to the US Zionist coalition, okay, we'll join in this strike force, but only if you give us assurances and guarantees that we will have ultimate influence over northern Lebanon, the port of Tripoli, and that eastern Mediterranean maritime corridor, right? So we're at a tipping point right now, because if Giuliani is triggered, which everybody's opinion here is it will go ahead. How soon it will go ahead, nobody knows. You have July the 4th. You have Ashura tomorrow. You have the end of Muharram around the 19th of July, also the end of the World Cup. They generally allow these kind of things to end before a new kind of military operation. So it could be any time, in my opinion, in the next 3 weeks. What does this actually mean? Either Giuliani will try to secure like a buffer zone, one, to, as you said, isolate Hezbollah from any weapons supply from Iran. Weapons have been coming in because the mercenaries under Giuliani will do anything if you pay them. That's why they're mercenaries. So weapons have been allowed in. The fact that Giuliani every now and then says, we stop weapons going in, that's just literally, again, theater. But also in the mountain ranges on the Lebanese-Syrian border is where Hezbollah store all of their weapons and develop their missiles and so on deep underground, very similar to Syria and to Iran. And so that is why that is so fundamentally important for Israel to gain control of that territory so they can destroy Hezbollah's weapon capability now and for the future. That's one. The second possible operation is to actually enter Lebanon and take control of territory inside Lebanon on the border, which again will end in the same result. But if this goes ahead, you already have around 30,000 former Syrian army soldiers in the Bekaa region on the border, and you have another 70,000, more or less, in Iraq, alongside the PMU and Kataib Hezbollah, the various resistance units in Iraq. They've already threatened to enter Syria should Jolani enter the war against Hezbollah. You then have Yemen, who is also going to enter the war on behalf of Hezbollah, potentially invade Saudi Arabia. That's how many people here see it, right? So Saudi Arabia is under pressure. Saudi Arabia is actually trying to put the brakes on this operation because it understands that it will immediately be a target. But Iran will come into the war at that point to defend Hezbollah. So we're entering, in my opinion, even I could speculate that the MOU and the length of time it's taken to finalize the MOU, which at the end of the day, it's an MOU. It's not binding. It's not a binding agreement on either side, right? It's a diplomatic exercise, which has taken a lot of time. And in my opinion, that time has been provided in order to prepare for this next stage in the war. That's how I'm reading things, and based on the information that I'm receiving from on the ground inside Syria.
Well, that sounds very scary, to be honest. I'm not going to lie, but my question then is, I mean, that means that you have Yemen, Hezbollah, Iran, some resistance factions also in Iraq. You have these people fighting against the biggest behemoth of empire in human history. And I'm like, my question is then, because according to the anti-imperialists, we also have Russia and China. So where do they come into in this play? I mean, if I have to believe many people in the anti-imperialist sphere, China and Russia would never stand for that. So my question is, then where are they? Okay, so I hear a lot of speculation. Oh, it happens all behind the scenes and it happens all in the background. And okay, I haven't seen any real evidence yet, but I'm willing to believe you. But this is very harrowing. This is, I would say, also very dangerous for a country like China. How do you see that, Vanessa? Do you think that they would try and put a stop to this, or are they just in the background letting it all happen?
I think to a degree, China's policy, and I'd like to get Fee's opinion on this, but from what we've seen, China's policy is very much to sit back and wait and let the pieces fall and see how it could be of benefit to China long term. Let's be realistic. China has a pragmatic economic and geopolitical policy, right? It doesn't allegedly want to interfere in conflict or in, of course, in my opinion, it does very much through the back door, like supplying the weapons to UAE that are then supplying those weapons to the RSF in Sudan. It supplies drones to the enemies of Iran. It supplied drones to Saudi Arabia when it was waging the war against Yemen, and so on. We can basically put that aside and say, okay, that's China's pragmatic policy. Russia is more involved. Russia has demonstrated its allegiance to Israel throughout the war against Syria. There are multiple examples which we can't probably go into right now, but I have talked about them in the past. Russia has a very kind of tenuous hold in the coastal region. And in my opinion, right now, with Ukraine coming back in, it's a very precarious one, because the elements within the armed forces of Jelani see Russia very much as the country that was bombing them when the regime change war was ongoing. So for them, prior to attacking Hezbollah, they actually want to get their revenge on Russia. So there's also potential, particularly with Ukraine now building up a presence back inside Syria, that Russia might be attacked, right? What that then does to Russia is Russia going to enter the war on behalf of who? Iran, Hezbollah, Iraqi resistance. In my opinion, that's extremely unlikely, because they're dealing with a war in Ukraine, which isn't going particularly well for them. There's reports today that Ukrainian drones entered as far as 1,500 kilometers inside Russian territory. The deals with Trump are not going according to Kirill Dmitriev's plans, right? So I can't see Russia entering into this. So there is potential for Russia to lose its remaining foothold in the Middle East region, which of course gives it a launch pad into Africa. But I'd be quite interested to get Fee's opinion on what Russia might do in if there is this level of escalation.
Yeah, Fee, go ahead. You're muted.
I agree on how Russia would respond. I don't think that they're going to get into this global hot war on behalf of Iran. And, again, going back to the way people see this in the anti-imperialist BRICS world, BRICS is winning, BRICS is this, BRICS is not. I'm not looking at what's happening as a win, because it's not that simple. As Vanessa said, this is continuous, as we all see it right now. Like, this is a continuous effort of a long war, a battle that I think is essentially between some of the most psychopathic and evil people that exist, and people trying to resist that. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing is the United States and Israel take down government after government, and that has to be acknowledged. As Alina said, you have to acknowledge when they gain these these wins for these sorts of battles, because then we can look at what's actually happening instead of what we would want to happen. Because what I would want to happen is very different than what I'm seeing happen, unfortunately. And with Russia and China, you have two world powers that have gained economic power, political power, and even regional power and expansion as well. And Russia, very much like China, is a pragmatic player. They have their self-interest in mind when they have these deals. In fact, BRICS, which is very much heavily led by Russia and China, is aligned very much like the UN in every aspect. So you're not really seeing this radical shift. What you're seeing is a continuation of that agenda, where you're going to have Saudi Arabia, you're going to have the Gulf involved, and you even have Israel involved. Russia's relationship with Israel is not just a strategic one, it is a personal one that is even exaggerated more so by Putin, when he constantly talked about, Russians living in Israel. When you actually talk to Russian people, there's a lot of pushback against that. There's a lot of almost animosity, because a lot of Russians cannot travel freely. Yet, a lot of these Russians living in Israel have two passports. A lot of the Russian elite have multiple passports, where they can come in and out of the country, while the population is not allowed to move. And in fact, it is highly discouraged from going abroad, because Russia has a population problem. And so what Russia will do, I think, is continue looking at its national self-interest, as it has been doing this whole time. They have an alliance with Iran, a strategic partnership that is not rooted in any sort of defense pact like it has with North Korea, for example. And that pact with North Korea, I think it's more of a benefit to them in terms of what could potentially happen to them, rather than anything, of some sort of ideological belief. Russia is a capitalist country. Russia is not the Soviet Union. They are not advancing to promote an ideology. They are advancing to essentially promote the growth of their country economically, and that's it. Like there's no this the same type of belief, for example, that Iran has, the resistance has, that's rooted in this altruistic type of behavior, type of strategy. That's not what Russia or China are. And people can say China's communist, and they're engaging in outright global capitalism, and they're very good at it. And they've been doing it right now in front of everybody, to the point where they've made so many countries, including its partner Russia, dependent on it. Russia depends a lot on China. That relationship is not an equal relationship. That relationship is like this. And so right now, Russia, and this is something most people aren't talking about either, Russia is not winning the same way they were winning 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I would have said, yes, Russia is winning full on. They have the military power. They have the political power. Now's the time. Putin didn't act. And now all of the wave that was building up, the tsunami, is coming back on Russia, because now what is happening is, as Vanessa pointed out, Ukraine's been droning parts of Russia, not just parts of Russia, but Moscow. Moscow's been getting bombed. Moscow, the city, like 9 miles from the Kremlin, so a few kilometers from the Kremlin, it's been getting bombed. People have been killed now inside Russian territory. That didn't happen. That was unheard of as of even a year and a half ago. But now this is happening constantly. Simultaneously, you have the internet issue, which, yes, it can be used to manufacture consent for revolt. But I think in Russia, it's different than Iran, because before, Russia wasn't getting bombed and droned constantly. This started a while ago with the VPNs, with the attacks on WhatsApp, with the downing of Telegram. What does that do? Well, that there wasn't a reaction from the Russian government against the drones against Ukraine. We haven't really seen them react to that. But what they've been doing is going after the internet aspect. There's this fear going around inside Russian society, where people are getting really fed up with the state of the war, how long it's taken, that it's taken longer than World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as they call it. And this was supposed to be the special military operation. This wasn't even looked on as a war. This is not what Putin said. They were winning. Now what we're seeing is more people come and hound the youth and anybody available to fight the war. The Russians aren't getting the real numbers of how many fatalities there are. Yes, Ukraine has more fatalities by far, but the numbers that Russia is giving, as pretty much any other country would, are significantly less. And so people are fighting this out, and they're getting a little bit, okay, what are you going to do? Because now NATO and the UK seem to be completely convinced that they will go to war with Russia. Meanwhile, Kirill Dmitriev keeps having to go beg Donald Trump to extend the sanctions relief every single time. But what's not happening is the attacks from Russia. Russia said that if you attack inside Russia, you're breaking red lines. Well, where is Ukraine getting these weapons from? Where is Ukraine getting the financial capital to continuously attack Russia? It's from the United States and obviously NATO. So again, everybody's saying, oh, Putin is tough, Russia's tough, they're going to go after Ukraine. They haven't, though. So what exactly is going on? What is stopping them from doing what they said they would do all along when the West crossed a red line? And I think people need to ask the tough questions. Why is Russia not doing that? Why is Russia not going after them? Why is Russia not going straight into Kiev and ending the war if they're winning, right? Why aren't they just forcing the United States to negotiate? That's not happening, which tells you that either things are not what we're being told by Russian media and a lot of these very popular Russian commentators that only get one side of the perspective because that's all they talk to. And so you have to really acknowledge that maybe perhaps Putin doesn't have the manpower, isn't in the military top position that they were just a couple years ago, that they've been trying to work around some economic deal, transactional deal with the United States via Alaska, that's been going on for over a year. And they haven't really received anything for it. In fact, Lavrov made a statement recently, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign ministry spokesman. He basically said that, well, if the Alaska deal was just an excuse for Ukraine to continue arming itself and for NATO to build up power, well, that would be devastating, something along those lines. And to me, that just shows naivete from Russia. And this is something that I've experienced and continuously talked about. Is
sorry
that
sorry for jumping in, Fiorella. So, do you feel that the MOU has a bit of that same kind of Alaska deal vibe, or not?
Yeah, well, in linking those two, I think that there is this naivete almost, and I wouldn't say it's from everybody in Iran. The same thing, like it's not everybody in Russia, but there is a sector, and there are also the fifth columnists that, very much like in Iran, the liberals, they want to normalize with the West. And that is their ultimate strategy. That is their card. They think that by doing this, it's a win because they'll push off any attack, any sort of war, which is good for business. These people are leading with this idea of business. This is like the age of normalization that we've been talking about with Vanessa. And so that is essentially what is happening on both ends. And there is this naivete with these people because they still believe that they can make a deal with the devil and come out on top. What I think is happening is there's going to be some sort of fracturing of Russia. I think that it's past the point of decision where that it's going to happen. I think it's only a matter of time, unfortunately. And me saying this, I will get completely slammed because everybody else is telling them that they're winning. There's so much internal and external pressure right now in Russia that it's breaking it apart also from within, which is also creates the conditions, of course, for intervention.
So one more question on the Russia part. I actually a while back I spoke at the local seminar here at academia. I spoke to a Russian professor, and out of respect, I'll just keep him anonymous. But he said he was convinced. And he was not a pro-Western guy, by the way, but he was convinced that the death toll of Russians is much, much worse than we think. And I said, not as bad as Ukraine. And he was like, he would not be surprised if the difference is not that big. And I have also, I wonder just about what you just said just now about Putin. What is your feeling is going on here? Is it that Putin has been educated in the West and he just has still that soft spot for the West? Or are we talking about Zionist oligarchs that are holding him back? What is going on here? Why is he so unwilling he's willing to punish his own population, apparently, with internet, stoppage of internet and all that stuff, but not willing to push through when it comes to Ukraine. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, so Putin is scared. I think there's a lot of fear. He's been targeted for assassination attempts. We've seen he's been told by the people surrounding him, kind of like there's a lot of similarities here with Syria, and I think Vanessa could also kind of touch on that. Like he's being surrounded by people who are not giving him the full scope of what's actually happening with the population, the dissatisfaction of the population, not just regarding the internet. It's regarding surveillance, regarding the inability to speak anything online where they're like being framed as, any complaint can be framed as you're for Ukraine. It's gotten worse. And we can understand that, from a nation at war that you shouldn't really be, trying to invoke the same ideas of NATO. Totally understandable. But taking it even further and further and further, then there's the economic inflation. And that's happened in Russia. Things have gotten extremely expensive from 2022 to 2026. In those 4 years, everything went up. I mean, everything, the price of rent, the price of goods, the price of everything. And, simultaneously, you have people with a lot of money going into Russia and saying, oh, look at how cheap everything is. Yes, you're coming from the United States where your salaries are significantly higher and you're making videos saying how cheap everything is in Russia. But like people in Russia, an average doctor makes, $1,000 a month. I mean, like, whereas in the United States, it's astronomically bigger. So it's just this idea that people have been sold, either NATO's right, and everything that Ukraine and all of NATO say is right, that Russia is terrible, that Russia's falling apart, that the Russian people are horrible, or that everything's wonderful and peaches and perfect. Like neither of these things are true. And what's actually true is somewhere in between. You have a society that is still going through the stages of capitalism. It's not at the stage the United States is in, which is a later stage, but it is at a stage where you have an elite. A lot of the elite are actual Zionist elite. You have these people, these oligarchs. You can call them oligarchs, you can call them elite. They're making a lot of money. They're the ones that continue the cycle. There's a lot of nepotism. If you're not from a family where you have somebody that's worked in government or worked in a company, it's harder to move up. A lot of the things that these anti-imperialists hate about the United States exists in Russia, but they just don't acknowledge them because, of this whole dynamic. And so it's just, we have to really acknowledge the truth of that. And I agree with this guy. I mean, I don't think that it is higher than Ukraine's, just based on the fact that even in Ukraine, you have women now fighting in the army, being forced to fight because they don't have people. But I do think that is much higher than the Russian people are being told. And the Russian people know this. If you go to any sort of Russian forum with regular Russian people that have their opinions about their country, they will say, no, we're being lied to. This is much higher. It's not being shown on the Yandex maps. And so the inflation is bad. All these things are bad. What's Putin doing? It seems he's scared. So he's got a lot of people around him that are telling him a lot of lies. They're not informing him on what's actually happening. And I think a lot of the actions being taken by the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, are really out of touch with what's happening on the ground. And because Russia's not in a position where they're going to go towards any sort of communist revolt, because the population, a youth, doesn't really look at that as valuable. The population that looks on that nostalgically is dying already. So that's not going to happen. I think what you're going to have it open to is a more liberal type of agenda. And this is why you're seeing the Russian government push the orthodoxy, push the conservatism, and align itself with the U.S. right, because that is kind of like their thing. Oh, we're brothers because we have the same Christian values and the traditional values.
Yeah, that
but
isn't going to work.
That's the country that's trying to destroy you. So it just really makes zero sense.
Yeah, without communism, indeed, without communism or that radical socialism, you're not going to beat U.S. empire. If you think you can do it with Orthodox Christianity in combination with right-wing conservatism, you're just gonna be food for empire. I mean, it's just not gonna happen. You're not gonna beat empire within the capitalist system by going right-wing conservative and with the free market or hyper-capitalist policies. And this makes absolutely no sense. So that's a big shame. It sounds weird, but they need communism, I think, to fight off empire. I mean, or of course, Shia Islam, but that's not going to happen in Russia. But you need some form of radical resistance ideology, I think, to be able to compete against U.S. empire. But the fact that Putin is scared you're suggesting that Putin is scared. I would say I wouldn't be surprised if you see that all the decapitations that happened recently with high-profile people. I think I totally believe you that the man is probably extremely scared. You know, you saw it with
Yeah.
the supreme leader in Iran. You saw it with people in the consulate and other high people, and Nasrallah, of course. He's probably super scared. Like I'm next, you know. So he's trying to tiptoe through this war. You know what I mean? Maybe in the end he's a human being, but yeah, let's not forget, of course, what has been happening lately to all these high-profile people.
Yeah, no,
Elena,
totally.
you want to jump
Yeah.
in?
Yes. So I actually had, so I have a little bit of a different take on on certain things. And the reason I have a different take is because I perceive that the United States, although it has had wins, right, in the Greater War, um, it is also in a very strenuous position itself. And this is something that I feel is not, I think in the previous episodes that we had, for example, when I was discussing like Richard Medhurst's theory, and I explained all of, why essentially the United States is in a vulnerable position. This means, and I kind of want to get back into what this means for the Iran Memorandum of Understanding, what this means for the region, if there's going to be a war in Lebanon, if they can afford that, and then obviously tie that in together really quickly with regards to Russia and China. Because the reality of the situation is that currently the United States is in a position, and this is a fact, right? This is even reported by their own think tanks. They are facing significant military shortages. We also know that they have a backlog of and a massive amount of weapons, defense systems that they need to mass produce, not only for themselves, but also for their allies, specifically the EU, and also its East Asian allies, whether it's Korea, Japan, etc. They're also in dire need of these military stockpiles that have also been affected because the United States has been essentially requesting the moving around of certain, air defense systems, as well as obviously other forms of missiles, in order to concentrate on their war efforts in other parts around the world, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in West Asia more broadly. And the situation is, if we also look back as to what Trump has been saying alongside the entire administration in the last few months, there has been this outrage and this friction between the state and the defense sector, meaning the military industrial complex, whereby they're stating that there's been all these massive tax cuts for these major corporations, and they've been engaging in mass stock buybacks, essentially kind of bringing up the value of their own their own stocks, increasing their market capitalization of their own companies, but not really investing in the kind of mass producing what the country actually needs. And in fact, Trump went as far as to say that they will actually he might carry out a policy against those tax cuts for these corporations, or rather against stock buybacks, which was illegal actually in the US until the 1980s, so as to coerce them essentially to use those excess massive super profits that they're making into making sure that they can actually mass produce, because the US and its allies are in very volatile positions. This is notwithstanding the fact that the US itself doesn't actually have the industrial capacity to be able to mass produce at the required levels. And we also have to remember that the EU, for its part, has actually now committed itself to 1 trillion investment overall in the defense industry. That is 800 billion for the EU as a total. Then there was like 10 billion, I think, agreement through NATO to fund Ukraine. And then also they pulled out a loan. I can't remember how much the loan was. It was a loan in order to essentially fund, again, the Ukraine war. And I think it was around as well 10, 15, I think it was maybe 5-6 billion, something like that. So all in all together, we're looking at a massive commitment of 1 trillion almost, which is coming out of the EU taxpayer, and that's going to have repercussions within the EU economies that are also deteriorating at a rapid pace. And that's why we're seeing a rise in the far right in the in the European Union, but also we're seeing although more subtle growths in the so-called far left as well, but far more subtle than the growths in the far right and the support for the far right. So we're seeing how the EU is who has demilitarized rather significantly, is in need of these military shipments that the US can't produce. And even now, I remember in Politico a couple of months ago, there was huge concerns coming out of leaders and members of the political establishment, even in Asia, as well as the EU, because they were seeing the shipments that were on en route to EU and Asia were actually redirected to the Middle East because rather West Asia, because the United States is seeing, is seeing such a massive reduction in its own defense capacity uh, due to the ongoing war. So it has stretched itself thin, and it lacks industrial capacity to be able to actually meet its own requirements. And I remember reading a report from the CSIS, I think a few years ago, it was even before October 7th, that it actually stated that in a war between the US and China, the US would only have enough ballistic missiles and defense capacity to last for about 3 weeks in that war. And that was before October 7th. That was before the events that have just taken place. And that report actually concluded that the war will not be won militarily, but it will be won by the country who has the greatest industrial capacity to be able to withstand it. And the US would lose in that kind of scenario. And right now, it's depleted itself rather significantly. And then I think it was some months ago as well, where they were having a TNT crisis as well, which is obviously what you need to mass produce. With only Poland being the country that can, that actually produces that for the Western kind of military industrial complex. And this is again notwithstanding the fact that they need rare earths, lithium, etc., all of that which comes from China. And we know how that China, during the trade war, China was leveraging that against the US in order to essentially balance the scales during the trade war. And it was successful because the US, as it currently stands, doesn't even have enough, rare earth materials for its entire aerospace industry, with reports coming out of Reuters that were essentially saying that contractors had to turn away customers because there wasn't enough to go around. Effectively, there's an issue. There's a supply and demand issue here. And then there's obviously the entire AI race that the United States is trying to win, and building the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and all of that they need if they're trying to build the 1,500 AI data centers that they're trying to, essentially prop up to supposedly outbeat China in this AI race. And so, from its perspective, continuing the war in West Asia is going to be a massive drain on military defense resources, as well as on its very conservative rare earth minerals that it does completely rely on China. And then the other angle behind that is the impact that in a war, if it was to escalate in the region, right, significantly, because I wouldn't put it past, I wouldn't put it past them. It's not what I'm saying, but looking at it from the US perspective, if this was to escalate, what would it mean? It would mean that Iran would get back into the war. The Memorandum of Understanding would be instantly shut down, of course, and Yemen would also enter that war. So we're now going to have a broader war in the region, which would risk, again, the closing down of the Strait of Hormuz, but also the Red Sea. And this would have dire economic implications, not just for the US, but for its allies, for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE, whose economies have already been constrained rather significantly in just the last few months because of the shutting down of the Strait of Hormuz, because they rely on that for the export their own energy, fossil fuels, right? Also, then you have countries like South Korea and Japan, but then you also have, Taiwan, all of which are major suppliers for the US tech industry. And when they are in a situation where essentially they're not having enough access, or that they're getting their energy is imports are, which are they're very energy import orientated independent states, particularly from the Gulf, when their energy imports are being essentially strangulated, and because of a greater war in the region that's not going to expand even to the Red Sea, possibly, and of course the Strait of Hormuz, that is going to impact their own economic capacity to mass produce the necessary equipment that the defense industry needs, the aerospace industry needs in the US, as well as the AI tech industry. And we must always remember the AI tech industry, Nvidia, all these companies are pretty much at the moment some of the major corporations that are upholding the entire US stock market, which again, it's fabricated capital. And that it gives artificial illusion of growth of the US economy that, as a financialized economy that doesn't really produce anything else. This is how it sustains itself. And by having that, it increases the kind of foreign, the investment in US capital assets that sustains the US deficit. So if a broader war like that was to occur, right, this wouldn't be to the benefit of its allies. It wouldn't be better. I don't think even the US would be able to handle that. And Israel has depleted the vast majority of TMT uses, but also like a lot of the United States air defense systems. And imagine if what this would mean if now this war escalates to the point that there is a ground invasion of Lebanon with Iran involved, Yemen involved. I think that the US itself wouldn't be able to handle it. And I remember even the intelligence report that came out was a couple of weeks ago from the US intelligence report anyway, was basically stating that even the blockade in Iran wouldn't really, of the Strait of Hormuz, it wouldn't really have any economic implications of Iran, not for at least a minimum, and they give a conservative for the next 4 to 5 months, because of the way that Iran has structured itself to buffer the impacts of such a blockade. But actually, it's the US that would probably suffer the most. And I honestly, economically speaking, this is also my conclusion. So this is what's important. Like, if the way I see it is that's why I argue. My argument is they're going to try as far as they to try to corner Iran now, to compromise as far as possible, because the other option, of which would be a full-out war, would not be to their favor either in the long run. If a war in the region expands to that degree for many months ahead, or even another 3 or 4 months, there's going to be massive economic repercussions on the US and its own and some of its largest industries, in a way that it will be very damaging. And also, we have to bear in mind, Saudi Arabia has only been able to export its oil, through that east-west pipeline, which could easily be, disrupted. And then, again, when you've also weakened the Gulf states, whose capital you've been relying on based on petrodollar kind of exchange, and through their wealth funds that have been the greatest investors in U.S. capital, keeping the deficit economy afloat and sustaining imperialism. If you're going to continue this war that impacts them directly, and we're already seeing, for example, the UAE was in a position where it was running out of dollars just a couple of months ago, and they need to get into a currency exchange program with the US. This again is going to affect the United States. So I'm of the opinion they're going to try to get Israel, which does have its own interests, right? But for the first time, we might see U.S. and Israeli interests, in my opinion, not completely aligned for a moment in time. And this is why they're going to try to rein them in temporarily to get Iran locked into a deal over the next 60 days. But again, we're going to see how Iran's going to handle that, right? Whether they will or not, that's open to question. I'm not saying it will. We're going to see how it's going to materialize and what's going to come of it. But if they can get Iran to kind of sign this memorandum of understanding in its completion in the next 60 days, which is going to be the final signing of the last sort of amendments, then through that, their idea is to try to cut access to the axis of resistance and weaken them, and in a different kind of format. And then through that process, once Iran is tied down, then they're going to start the economic strangulation. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, etc. We know that all of these Gulf states have been using the economic hardships that have been imposed on Iran as a mechanism to essentially buy out the South, even making offers to the resistance fighters, saying we can offer you jobs, and basically turning the South into a massive economic hub of its own. And so they're going to find a different medium by which to do that, while simultaneously keeping the Syrian fighters that Vanessa was stating on the side, to possibly infiltrate gradually. And I think we can Hezbollah alongside as well with the Lebanese armed forces, whilst having to a certain degree, taken, compromise its support which has been Iran. So I think it's going to be a little bit more gradual. That's my personal belief, right? That's how I view things, just because of the position that I see the U.S. and the Gulf states, who, because it's not all triumphant for them either. And with regards to everything else that was said, if we're talking about China and Russia, etc., I mean, this is such a broad topic as well. I do agree with what Fiorella said, what Vanessa said. They are obviously going to be looking at things, as they always do, very practically, where their interests lie in all of this, as they always do. I think with regards to the region, at least in West Asia, they're allowing things to just sort of see how they materialize, to what extent they will materialize at this point in time. Because the other argument that, for example, I would make there is the US has, even with Syria, right? It was, I mean, when Syria happened, it was a, I didn't expect Syria to fall that fast. It was a massive shock to a lot of us, to be honest. And I understand that. But even then, it hasn't really consolidated. Jolani is incapable of consolidating power there for the West, or even for Turkey. And there's also the other angle, the whole Turkey Israel angle, who have up until this point have always been allies, but now the friction is arising from who's going to dominate the region. And they both have their own vested interests, where Turkey wants to be a power in the region. Israel would never allow Turkey to be a power in the region. And so that's going to cause certain friction as well within the whole, I guess, imperial alliance, which, I've often said there is a hierarchy within the collaboration of these states, and not all is made equal. So I think they're going to view what's going to happen, as in Russia and China going to be viewing what's going to happen here. With regards to Syria, like I said, it didn't consolidate power, and I don't see them succeeding that necessarily in Lebanon either. And I think there is an understanding at this point that through war and coercion, they won't necessarily succeed in their goals against Hezbollah. So they're going to try to accomplish it through different means, and that's cutting Hezbollah off economically, and by conditioning the Lebanese state into normalization, and obviously weakening Hezbollah's role, so as to allow the IMF, the World Bank, and all this foreign capital from the Gulf states, etc., to enter Lebanon. I mean, this is so that's what I think. And that's why I think China and Russia are observing what's happening. And that, I mean, that's all I can say for now, because I would like to see what's going to happen in the next few days. And then I'll have a bit more of a stronger opinion as to what they should or should not do. Because like, my opinion is that a lot of these plans that the US have won't materialize to the extent that it will completely benefit them. And in actuality, it will create a kind of destabilizing force that will ultimately not even allow them to achieve their goals. And with regards to Russia, yeah, I mean, listen, the situation in Russia, like I've always said, it is a capitalist country. It is, at the end of the day, one that has multiple different political factions inside it as well, an oligarchy of its own that has its own vested interests, and who there is still even a faction that is who wants to continue collaborating with the West. But the thing is as well, and I think something that a lot of analysts tend to undermine or underestimate is the economy of Russia. It is still a relatively weak economy. I mean, it's not China. The only reason it was able to withstand sanctions against the West is, yes, because it has its own energy power that it has, economically speaking, but also because of China. Therefore, created that kind of dependency. But I think one of the reasons that they're so measured is because, one, there's an ongoing friction that's growing with the EU, who constantly has this amplified war rhetoric against Russia. I mean, I was only just a few months ago, not even a few months ago now, I think it was like December, I was in Brussels, and for the first time, I had actually seen massive NATO banners all over the airport. I mean, I had never seen that before. The way that they're forcing NATO down the throats of the people, and they're preparing the ground and normalizing the idea of warfare is it's very interesting. And I think even Putin was saying recently, I think the Europeans want war, and so there is this idea that they're preparing for but preparing for a front with the broader EU NATO states, that I think is one of the main reasons as well that Russia tends to be a bit more reserved. And again, it's not economically as powerful as China. It's a country that's still developing. It's a country that still has massive economic disparity, and I don't think has the capacity to handle multiple wars on multiple different fronts without weakening itself. And I think that's a very important factor that goes into, I think, the way that Russia operates if it's looking out of its own self-interest. With China, I mean, China China is another very is a very broad topic, but I think with regards at least to West Asia, they're going to see how things evolve with the Memorandum of Understanding and how that will materialize with Lebanon and so forth. Of course, we know that China has on many occasions both provided, as Vanessa said, military equipment to the resistance, but then also, they're building the port and helping the Israelis build their port in Haifa. I mean, completely unnecessary. Completely unnecessary.
Massive
The
trade and
Israelis get enough.
massive trade still also with Israel. I do not call that pragmatic. I call that
No, it's not pragmatic. It doesn't.
it's
It needs to
it's
become, at the end of the
self-destructive
day,
in my
China.
opinion. It's in the long run self-destructive to feed the empire like that.
Mhm. And Israel does not need those funds. And at the end of the day, you're China. You're saying you're communist China. You're building towards a socialistic communist society. You are ideologues. Take a stance. So, providing financial relief and investment inside Israel, where there's so much money being pumped into Israel now, especially from defense corporations and the ruling class in the U.S., is really highly unnecessary. You can say this is an apartheid state. This is they're an illegal, occupying state, and we refuse to collaborate with that. And guess what? It would abide by international law, since they like to constantly, invoke international law, and it would actually gather the support of the global public in so many different ways. So I don't agree with that, and I'm also of the opinion. I'll finish this here, where I think as well, they should have done more is probably with Cuba, which is such a strategic important. I mean, it could be, I had a friend of mine tell me recently, it could have been their Taiwan in many ways. It's different, but like, it wasn't. It's a way to remain remain in the Americas. It would be a doorway to the BRI within the Americas, like I said. But above all, solidarity, internationalist solidarity with the Cuban revolutionary government, not allowing them to fall prey essentially and held at gunpoint, which is what happened, to liberalize the markets and destroy decades of revolutionary struggle in that way. And I feel like the way that China is as reserved as it is in that aspect, because they were concerned about the sanctions. You have enough leverage to have been able to essentially, bypass those sanctions and provide more even material support than what it has provided to Cuba. And yes, I know, and I discussed it, I think, in my own personal platforms. China has obviously helped Cuba in terms of providing it with renewable energy to make it energy self-sufficient by 2028. But as I said there, Cuba doesn't have until 2028, and here we are today. So, and once American capital is inside Cuba, it will try to meddle in its relations with China, and it will try to essentially kick out any sort of business that threaten American interests in the region. And this is what we're going to see. So with West Asia, I think they're going to wait. I think with what's happening in West Asia, I would to a certain extent wait, because I'm also curious to see how things are going to plan out, because I don't think that the United States has the inertia militarily and politically and economically to pull through more of a war. But with regards to, I think, its support for Israel, especially as in its military, its material support for Israel, and especially its lack of assistance to Cuba, or its more reserved approach, I think should definitely be critiqued, and by anybody who labels themselves as an anti-imperialist. And I think it helps. I think it helps China as well, right? That's the whole point. We're supposed to critique and improve at all times. It's important to do so, not just passively sit there and like, oh, everything that's done is great, it's beautiful. Now we're just sounding like Trump. So,
Yeah, and
but yeah, that's sort of. Yeah.
I totally. I just wanted to jump in on what you just said, and I also have to wrap it up soon because I'm tired as hell and it's super late here. But I wanted to say that there is it's very hard to understand that kind of reservedness that we see among the Chinese. It's a form of I have no idea. We can't even call it modesty. It's just so peculiar to me. Like you're such a behemoth of of a country. You have so much leverage. You also say you're a communist society. You would expect you would stand for the oppressed in some way, shape, or form after 3 years of genocide. That's just what I'm thinking. And and then one would say, yeah, but China is doing the long game. It's very reserved, this and that. And I'm like, but the long game, when the world is set on fire and innocent people are erased from the earth, I think is morally more than questionable. I find it so weird that people defend that. I mean, with power comes responsibility. Sorry, guys, with power comes responsibility. And yeah, I don't know. I'm deeply struggling with this stuff because, like I said, I have a passion for China. I live in China, and it's very difficult to reconciliate these two things. Like on the one hand, I think China's a very promising, amazing culture and society. On the other hand, I think the Chinese at this point have a exceptionally frustrating passive foreign policy. I don't mean military intervention. Nope, absolutely not. Everybody who says it, oh, you want China to be military, want to be imperialist? No, I don't want that. I just want China to say until here and no further because they can. And one thing they could do is say we're not going to trade with the attack dog of empire anymore because you guys are destroying the world. And our BRICS members, you're attacking our BRICS members. It's not gonna happen anymore. No, that's not happening. They're receiving Trump and having pretty little Chinese girls wave flags when he exits the airplane. I find that extremely frustrating. You can say, okay, come on, these are just symbolic things. But we just had the Epstein case and we have a Donald Trump, and then you have all these. You receive that guy like that in that moment during such a extremely volatile period in West Asia where they are actually encroaching on China, where the empire is encroaching. Yeah, call me naive or an idealist. I find it unbelievable. Unbelievable. I have no idea how to see this, how to, like I said, to reconcile the on the one hand the big promise of China, on the other hand, in my opinion, so bad when it comes to foreign policy and the terror that's being inflicted on the world by the U.S. empire and Israel. You know. So with that, I think we should end it here. Maybe final thoughts, Vanessa and Fiorella, and then we can head to bed. Oh, I can head to bed. Sorry.
No, I mean, I don't know. I think my final thought would be Elena's points about the US capability of maintaining perpetual war are very limited, but that plays into the hands of the resistance. So I'll leave that there, because what that actually means is there is now potential for the resistance to increase their power in the region. And so I see that very much as a positive. While I completely agree with Elena, from that perspective, but then I think the resistance has to be prepared to actually capitalize upon that vulnerability of the US and the Zionist bloc in this region. And me personally, and from the opinions of people here, people in Syria, people in Iraq, that is also how they perceive it. So I think there's a flip side to what Elena said there, which actually plays into the hands of the resistance and the IRGC and the Islamic Revolution. And I don't think we should ignore that.
I agree with that. I just want to say, I do agree with that. That's why I'm saying when I brought it up, I was meant to say That's why the US is trying to use what it can. It's their last attempt because they can't afford a war to continue. And I think this could be a leverage for the RGC, or rather even the Iranians at the negotiation table. That's why I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. But I do think it's leverage for the resistance. I want to clarify. That's why I said it's a positive. That's why I wanted to clarify. It's not all wins for the US. I said these are there are lots of negatives.
Yeah, no,
Just to clarify.
I saw it as that. I saw it that you were saying that. But what I'm also saying is that then it's of benefit to the resistance potentially for this regional war to actually go ahead. As costly as it will be, it could potentially long-term play into their hands. And if we're looking at the long-term picture, then it's of greater benefit to the resistance to have the war now than to give America breathing space, to give Israel breathing space, give the Gulf states breathing space to be able to rebuild their economy after the 39-day war, right? So to a degree, it all I'm saying is it benefits the resistance to accelerate rather than decelerate right now. So that's why, to some degree, I do think it's going to come to fruition sooner rather than later.
That's a positive note. Thank you, Fiorella.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up by saying, I think that the United States is, as we knew it, is falling apart. As the American people knew it, with the American dream is falling apart. What it was looked on as this great power is falling apart. But I don't think for 1 second the United States elite, the defense industry, the mechanisms that now govern the world that are tied to the United States, to Zionist Israel, and to parts of the Western world and beyond the Western world, you could even say parts of the Asian world as well, have been defeated. I think what's happening is they're preparing themselves to go beyond nation states. And as the United States loses the economic war to China, this is why it's making all its gains in Latin America for these rare earth minerals, lithium, copper, silver, all of these minerals that are being used in this fourth industrial revolution fight against China that it's already lost with AI and surveillance. What I'm seeing, though, is the people, the anti-imperialists, embrace AI coming from China or Russia that are very much in line with it and continuously go against it in the United States. It's the same technology, and such great technology and power, as you said, Kareem, comes responsibility. And if we're going to believe that, just because the United States isn't going to have the power, that suddenly this is actually good because all the power is going to go to China, I think, I don't believe that. I think this is beyond, this is going to go beyond nation states. We're moving towards elites, predator classes that are ruling the world, and less importance is going to happen. It's going to be given to these nation states, and the resistance is the last stand that we're seeing coming from Iran against that. We're seeing some of these pockets in Latin America, for example, through Bolivia, in Albania. We're seeing these actual acts of resistance, but in a world where you have the majority of surveillance and all of that already set in place, and the mechanisms have been done, it's going to be very difficult. I think there will be moments where we can do it, but I just don't see that we need to look at it as the United States like just failing. I think it's more of a transformation towards the next phase. And so it's just not, I'm not trying to be, again, do me here. But what I do know about the United States is they always have the card up their sleeve, even if it seems like they're losing ground here, that for any sort of respite for them is an opportunity. So I do agree that Iran should continue the war, because any sort of pause, even though it may also be a benefit to themselves, is also a greater benefit for the United States and its allies. And there is no separation from Israel and the United States. They're literally like completely in line, just like it is with Ukraine and NATO. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I'm I'm starting to believe that cyberpunk future of a world where corporations run the world, very powerful corporations with royalty that is actually the CEOs that are running those corporations. I don't think that's a weird prediction that is the world we're heading to. These massive Monsanto kind of behemoths of corporations that are nation states. That's an old thing from the past. These are going to run the world, and there is a you can almost say a final battle going on beyond Iran. I have no idea what's gonna. Yeah, if China would be full blown behind Iran, that would maybe topple the things the other side. But I just don't know how to evaluate that. I think that's a discussion for another time. I do think we should do that sometimes, respectfully and nuanced, of course. But I hope we can do that panel sometimes, that we dive a bit deeper into what is China now doing. What's exactly going on here? That would be great. Anyway, I'm going to bed. I'm going to sleep. I have to teach tomorrow again. This was a fantastic panel. I loved it. I really, really loved this one. So many things, such a good vibe, the four of us. Hopefully we can do this again. And for now, thank you and good night.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat medium makes you feel. No borders, no change. No silence,